Happy Friday, everybody. It's good to see you here for another episode of Drumversations. I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. And as always, we will take some time to breathe, honor our ancestors, and talk about some really interesting things with respect to police brutality and perception of African American youth that has been happening in Columbus, and I'm sure it's happening around the country. And so I want to just share some of my thoughts about that. But first, again, we just breathe to center ourselves and to create community in this virtual space. So breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in all the wonderful things the universe has for us. And exhale all the anxiety and negative energy that is just being pounded upon us. Psychological violence in the news, 45, all the uncertainty around COVID. So breathe in goodness and breathe out all that foolishness. Ashe. So, as always, we honor our ancestors to remember who we are. Again, in times like these, remembering who we are and why we are through honoring our ancestors helps us combat that psychological and spiritual violence that's constantly perpetuated against us in the media. So put your ancestors' names in the chat. Again, ancestors are folks who are directly in our lineage, like we're descended from them by blood, but also important people for you and for the wider culture in history. So I'm not related to Malcolm X, but Malcolm X is also an ancestor, as an example. I'm going to play the ancestral drum call, and then we'll call those names. Ashe. My producer's asking for my phone, so give me a second. Solid. All right. Ed Bell, Ashe. Edna Bell, Ashe. Charles Bell, Ashe. William Bell, Ashe. Danielle Bell, Ashe. Mike Bell, Ashe. Patricia Bell, Ashe. George Bell, Ashe. Ashe, Ashe. For all the ancestors, those mentioned and not, we thank you for helping us be who we are and giving us what we need to be who we need to be in this moment. Last week, we discussed really the notion of race as a public health crisis. And across the USA, 50 cities have declared racism as a public health crisis. And what we outlined last week was the way that actually makes sense, right? Because historically, America has taken to victim blaming and blamed the people who are on the receiving end of racism for their problems and for the outcomes of racism without addressing the races themselves, and not just the individuals, the systems, infrastructure, institutions. And as you know, as the wind blows, I guess, there was an article in the Columbus Dispatch here in Columbus, Ohio, that really highlighted that, and I wanted to kind of bring that up in this conversation context because it's happening all over the place. And a lot of times, people, even black folk, don't really understand how insidious racism is and how it plays out and how people are treated generally, who are people of color, black people specifically, but how it gets ingrained in a young person's mind that then manifests in behaviors that those people are blamed for. So the details of the article are that over the last few weeks, in the neighborhood I grew up in, South Linden, 10 people were shot, 3 are dead, all were under the age of 26 and living, obviously, in Linden, the neighborhood I grew up in. The mayor of Columbus said that the community and lawmakers need to be outraged and willing to wage war over guns illegally in the hands of youth. Columbus police and others interviewed say it's difficult, if not impossible, to convince young people to stop the violence. One officer even said he and other officers that patrol that neighborhood are truly at a loss for what to do. After they've arrested the young people and tell them they could end up dead, you know, the officer literally said, they just don't care. What else can we do? Then a community member, someone living in Linden, who is next door to one of these incidences, said, these kids don't have a conscience. They're not like the rest of the kids. Direct quote, these kids don't have a conscience. They're not like the rest of the kids. They would shoot you and probably go get a sandwich and not think too much about it, right? So we have a mayor, position of authority, running the city, saying that the community and lawmakers should be upset and want to wage war. What does that mean, really, right? That language is problematic to me. Then we have police officers saying they don't care. We arrest them. We tell them they might end up dead, which has a lot of implications in and of itself, right? But they don't care. And then we have community members saying that these kids don't have a conscience. They just as soon shoot you as go get a sandwich and not think too much about it, right? So we have political infrastructure, we have law enforcement, and we have community, all of which should be carrying adults writing these young black men off, right? The article doesn't say they're young black men, but I guarantee you the majority of them are, right? So I want to analyze this and kind of go through step by step what those issues are, how they play on the mentality, the psychology of these young people in general, because it's not just happening in Columbus, it's everywhere. The questions I have that I want to explore literally are, what does it mean to do, as the mayor says, to wage war over guns in the hands of youth? When you go to war against someone, someone else's military, right? America goes to war against another country, sovereign country, because of something, some interest, right? So if we're going to war over guns in the hands of young people, who are we really fighting against, right? Problematic statement, number one. It's two, when the police say they don't care, I think that that gives them license to treat these young people differently. That aligns with racist culture and behaviors. That then leads to what we consider police brutality or state-sanctioned violence and murder, right? And then when the adults in the neighborhood are not invested in the young people, that only exacerbates the situation and allows white folk in particular, but even some black people, to weaponize the police against these young people. So in all three cases, I think they're blaming the young people for manifestations of cultural, psychological, and spiritual violence that have been perpetuated against these young people. But again, calling racism a public health crisis in the way that the nation has typically behaved means that we blame those young people for shooting each other or at each other, right? Instead of blaming the culture itself, racism as a fundamental core of American culture that leads to these behaviors. So I'm going to play something and then we'll go deeper. What's that? Oh, we have some more ancestors we want to honor. Norma Thomas, Ashe, Auntie Norma. Grandma and Grandpa, Ashe.
Philip, David, Leela McCree.
Ashe.
Richard Kenny, Gary Thomas.
Ashe.
Willis D. Sanders Jr.
Willis D. Sanders Jr., Ashe. Ashe, oh. Okay, I'm going to play something. That's not what I'm trying to play. So, we've established from this article in the Columbus Dispatch about the youth violence happening in Linden that the mayor has said, is quoted, that the community and lawmakers need to wage war against guns illegally in the hands of youth, that the police have said they, meaning the young people, don't care, and they don't know what to do. They're at a loss, quote unquote, and that the community, represented by this neighbor, says these young people don't have a conscience, right? It reminds me of what Hillary Clinton said in the 90s, super predators, right? Where the guy who killed Mike Brown said he's a beast, right? When they don't have a conscience, that is dehumanizing, right? So I want to explore where this comes from in terms of American society and what the implications are. So it's interesting that Black America has been criminalized during and post-slavery consistently, given the fact that America is what's called a criminogenic society. Criminogenic means criminality is in the genetic detail or genetic makeup of a person, place, or thing, right? We're personifying objects. So in America's very DNA is crime. And so one could argue the fact that America became America due to 3 original sins, 2 of which being absolute inhumane behavior, the genocide or near genocide of First Nation peoples, and slavery, that the very nature of America is crime, criminal behavior, and inhumanity. And so what is more American than crime? Because of the criminogenic nature of our society, right? Even wealth, in America was built in many cases on a criminal act, like the bootlegging Kennedys, on some form of exploitation akin to slavery, and even post-slavery, making so much more than frontline workers and not providing basic needs. That's exploitation, right? And then the prison industrial complex, as an example, right, where you have folks who are in prison working for pennies a day while the corporations receiving those products get millions, right? One great example is Idaho potatoes. Those potatoes have been farmed, I don't know if they still are, but have historically been farmed by inmates for pennies on the dollar, and then that corporation makes a killing on the profit, right? So exploitation, criminal activity, and slavery, right? Even your boy 45, the way that the Trump family made their money was on exploitation and criminal behavior, because Trump does not pay his bills, right? So he'd rather sue you than pay you for work that you've already done. That's criminal and exploitative, right? So that's how people in America, white people historically, have made their money. No matter how nice they are, no matter how liberal they may be, there is some form of exploitation, criminality, that's happening to generate the inordinate amounts of wealth that America has. That's one. America is a criminogenic society. The very core of its being is a criminal nature, right? So from that perspective, calling these young men criminals is really like calling them Americans. So that's one. We have to understand the pathology of America, right? And then 2, this idea of toxic masculinity, right? This overreaching, overbearing, patriarchal idea of the American male, as shown in such figures as Dirty Harry, John Wayne, even Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt in the Mission Impossible movies. I mean, just name anybody, right? We have this idea of, Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando, right? His daughter gets taken, or even taken, what's that dude, Liam Neeson? All these white men, they solve problems in the most violent way possible, right? And because we're in a racist society of America, even when I was younger, I liked cowboy flicks. I was rooting for the cowboys who were killing people that looked like me. And so I'm getting these messages of a toxic masculinity, and the way that I solve my problems as a male is through some kind of violent behavior, right? So the criminogenic nature of American society, the pathology of American criminal behavior, and then the elevation of these violent tropes of masculinity in America are all working on the young people's psyche, specifically black youth, because that has now infiltrated the popular music of black America, right? There was a time where black popular music was about love. It was about having fun. It was about dancing. Even in hip hop, early hip hop, it was about love, having fun, dancing. And if I'm joning on you, if I'm coming at you like I'm harder than you, it's because my swag is better. I got a chain. It's some material thing that shows that I have achieved some kind of status, right? And there was balance. There was that party. There was that status thing. There was like that machismo kind of thing. And then it turned to misogyny. And then it turned to violence. And then it turned, and then it turned, and then it turned, and it got worse as the big media corporations began to buy up the smaller record labels that were producing hip hop in the early days. The messaging that came from hip hop artists became more misogynistic and more violent and more anti-black and anti-human. That's not something we did. That's something we're getting paid to do. And when you take a young person who's 17, 18 years old, who has some skills with words, and you pay them millions of dollars to call women bitches and hoes and to talk about how they're going to shoot their adversary, right? What do? If I'm 17 and I'm broke and I got a chance to make $1 million and all I got to say is this thing, I know that's not who I am. I'm playing a character, right? But the young people who are being influenced by this music don't understand that, because the music has always been a function of society and our culture, meaning there was some authenticity and truth to it. But many of us did not see the flip. We did not see the rise of the corporate construct as the narrative shifted to align with the corporatocracy that is behind the school to prison pipeline and everything else that is slavery by another name, right? So these are the things that are bearing down on young black people in America. The criminogenic nature of the society they live in, the negative and putrid, toxic portrayals of masculinity, and the absence of positive feminine models, right? Young women of color, young black women cannot just go to the grocery store and see themselves on a magazine, right? When they look at the videos that the corporatocracy are producing, it's black people wearing blackface. And the women are treated terribly and the men are behaving terribly. But that is supposed to be the model of success, because all we've been given, all that is lifted up in this racist society are black entertainers. And the messaging and the control of those images is done by white folk. And Nick Cannon, as an example, is someone who rose to prominence in that space, right? Playing that game, because to be successful in America means often that you have to deny an aspect or all of your blackness in order to be fitting and safe for the white people who are signing your checks. Nick Cannon is this person who did that, comedic, music, rapping, all that kind of stuff, acting. And then he starts to develop this consciousness, or his consciousness starts to come to the fore. And when he makes statements that were truthful, it is a fact that Jewish people helped finance slavery. It is a fact that white people in the North, whether they be just straight up white or Jewish white, were all complicit in the oppression, suppression, and repression of black and brown peoples. That is a fact. That's historic. So when Nick Cannon makes that statement, he loses his contract with Viacom. Why? Because he's exposing the issues that are facing black people, and he's shifting the narrative. They're not going to pay him to tell the truth on them. My dad always says, nobody's going to finance your liberation, right? So Viacom, a white-owned company, hearing this truth in a way that he can express it so that young black people who follow him will hear it, they're not going to finance the liberation of those minds. And so he gets cut off immediately and then has to apologize for speaking the truth. That's how America works. That's how insidious racism is. That a black person that has no absolute power to control anything can then be called racist for telling the truth. He can be called anti-Semitic for telling the truth. Semite means half. There's no such thing as a Semitic person unless you're talking about genetics, right? They're half this and half that. So to be anti-Semitic means that you're anti-half or biracial, and he's married to a biracial woman. Ain't she biracial? I'm saying, what's his wife's name? I'm talking to Ruth now. I can't remember her name. Oh, they were married? Yeah, Mariah Carey. Well, anyway, he married a biracial woman. See, my wife is helping me keep my facts straight. But what I'm saying, it's like saying what Dave Chappelle has said, that Asian people have been upset with him for making certain jokes, but he's married to a Asian woman, and like he says those jokes in front of her. Like, I mean, I say that to say they're aware of what they're saying. They are engaging the people they are supposed to hate in a way that is showing love in community. So it means the narrative is being flipped in order to maintain this lie and dissuade black popular figures from telling the truth to help young black people learn really what the situation is going on that they face every day. That's the bottom line, right? So to call Nick Cannon anti-Semitic or to call him racist and not deal with the fundamental aspects of what he was saying is to shift the narrative, right? That's how insidious this narrative is. And that's what these young people in this article are facing, and they're not aware of it. They don't know it. All they know is that in order for them to have status, in order for them to be the baddest cat on the block, they need to go grab a Glock and make it known. And then they are blamed for those behaviors. I'm going to play something, and then we're going to talk about how we fix all of that. I couldn't remember that lady name. All right, so let me clear something up. I said if you have wealth and you're white in America, if you have wealth in America, more often than not, it is from some kind of criminal behavior. And by criminal, I'm using a broad definition, and I'm including exploitation because I believe that exploitation is criminal. And some people might say, they might take offense, like, hey, I built my business, I worked hard these long hours, I did all this stuff. Yes, you did. But the fact of white privilege makes it exploitative, right? Because you're exploiting an unfair advantage that other people do not have because they don't have that skin privilege. So I just felt like I needed to clear that up in case somebody wanted to jump bad about what I said, because it's not false. It's very true. We just don't understand how all of these things work hand in hand. That's why I said it's insidious, right? So talked about the 3 cases made that dehumanize these young people by the mayor, the police, and the community. I talked about the criminogenic nature of America, the toxic masculinity, and how if you're black and successful and you want to shift the narrative or you try to shift the narrative, the system attacks you, right? No individual had to attack Nick Cannon because the system did it itself, right? White Twitter just lit up. Nick Cannon's racist. Well, if white Twitter knew what they were talking about, they would know Nick Cannon couldn't be racist because he's black. Racism is not our issue. It's something we have to deal with, but that's white people's issues, right? So that's where the education needs to happen. And I also talked about how in order to be successful in the American construct as it is, black people have to deny some aspect of themselves, and that touches upon the Du Boisian double consciousness, right? And so as soon as you begin to remove that mask, as Nick did, then you're not accepted in the white mainstream because you're not adhering to the narrative that they require of you in order for you to have that economic success, okay? So that's the environment. And there's a lot. There's a lot. We just don't have time to go into all of that. But those, I think, are some of the major issues that young black people, particularly young black men, face when it's incumbent upon them, like the onus is put on them to develop healthy identities when they're being raised in unhealthy environments. And the same is true for black women, young black women who do not see themselves in the mainstream as beautiful, who do not see themselves in the mainstream as powerful, who experience, no matter what their class status, infant and maternal mortality at I saw some data the other day, 4 to 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. Even if they have middle class economic status, that's what they call the black tax, right? And it affects black women and black men the same, but in different ways because we experience life differently, even though there are some overlaps, all right? That's the context in which black young people are trying to survive and figure it out, right? And then when you put folks in a confined area like a ghetto, right? It's like an 8-year-old. When an 8-year-old gets in trouble, they go to their room, they're sent to their room, and they tear up their own room because they don't have power to tear up the rest of the house, right? And so that energy, that negativity, that anger, that angst is then turned on their own neighborhood and in their own community. And so when you hear people like, well, why did they tear up their own community? It's because that's where they are constrained to, right? Where we often are relegated to these areas, right? So these young people are facing those issues. So I guess the bottom line to that part is if you want to continue to be successful, don't get Nick Cannoned. But you have to do that in order to start to shift the narrative. All right. So I think we have to understand the why in all of this in order to figure out a path forward. In that whole article, in everything that was said and reported, not once did the mayor, not once did the officer, and not once did the community or the reporter ask why. Never once did any of those stakeholders in that story ask why the young people are responding the way they are responding to their environment. Not once did they ask why did those young people think that guns were the answer, and not once did they think why would they turn those guns then on themselves and see themselves as the enemy, right? And personally, just looking at it, I don't think the guns are the problem. I think the society that has taught these young people that their lives don't matter makes the gun a viable option with respect to how to deal with problems. So again, we, America, blaming the victim, the young people who are perpetuating the violence as a result of the violence psychologically, spiritually, and otherwise that has been perpetuated against them, right? So the mayor of Columbus, in the article, said community and lawmakers, as if they're separate people, like the lawmakers aren't a part of the community, right? So there's always this bifurcation. The community and lawmakers, it's all the community, right, if we care. But the community and lawmakers need to be outraged and willing to wage war over guns illegally in the hands of the youth. What does this really mean? Yes, of course we should be outraged, but not about the guns. The guns aren't the problem. The circumstances that allow the young people to access guns, and more importantly, the circumstances that have convinced them that guns are a tool, is the problem. So why should we not be waging war on the racist culture that brought about the manifestation of these actions? Could it be that the mayor is white? Could it be that he's ignorant to these larger societal issues? Could it be that making that statement is dangerous because, again, like Nick Cannon, the system, quote unquote, the infrastructure, the institutional structural racism, that mechanism will turn against him and he will lose whatever power, influence he thinks he has? And why would we wage war against guns? In America, we have never won a cultural war that's been declared on anything. The war on poverty exacerbated poverty. The war on drugs exacerbated drugs. The drug issue, particularly in black and brown communities, right? And now we have a war, I guess, on opiate crisis, but we've been here. Black communities have been there. Crack in the 80s, heroin in the 70s, right? Whenever the country declares a war on a social issue, it actually exacerbates the issue. It doesn't resolve that issue. And that's not because money's not put behind it. Billions of dollars have been spent in the war on drugs to militarize police. And that's just given rise to the prison industrial complex, right? So you're spending billions of dollars here and you're making billions of dollars on the back end. White America profits regardless. Black America loses. So what exactly are we declaring a war on? I think that's dog whistle politics. Because when you say, and I quote, we need to be willing, quote, to wage war over guns illegally in the hands of youth, that suggests that the youth are the problem. And that, to me, opens the door for police to proceed with the brutality they're known for. Because you're placing the blame on the young people and not the culture that put those young people in place, in that position, right? So that's a dangerous statement, Mr. Mayor. Secondly, the cities, well, not secondly, in addition to that, that's a dangerous statement. And if you really want to fix it, the city should be focused, all cities should be focused on creating as equitable and inclusive an environment as possible, right? Because when you create a city environment that's equitable and inclusive, a lot of the issues that these young people face that makes the gun a viable option go away. You literally are shifting culture, right? If young people feel like they belong, then the way they value community is different because the way the community values them is different. That's the whole philosophy behind Black Lives Matter. All lives can't matter until Black lives do. And people are always like, white folks, well, black people kill black people. Well, white people kill white people. And most often, it's because those people doing the killing and in those environments in general do not value their own humanity, let alone that of someone else's. So if we create an environment where everyone is valued because of their human beingness, then we see a shift in the outcomes, the behaviors, and the violence goes down because we're not perpetuating violence against them. So if we're going to create a war wage a war, it should be against racism and the infrastructure that gives rise to racist policies that impact poor black and brown people and put them in a position where they have no other recourse in their own mind other than to hurt themselves and others because they're so angry, they're enraged. I'm mad every day, frankly. I am pissed every day. And it takes a lot of energy to interact with people who don't understand my pain as a black man in America. And I happen to have a little bit of training, a few degrees, right? I have some white cards that I can pull whenever I need to. But these young people, they don't have the benefit of that, right? So put a pin in that because we're coming back to that. So instead of waging war, civic leaders need to be focused on building equitable, just, and inclusive societies within their communities. Period, point blank. That begins to solve your problems, right? Secondly, the police say they're at a loss and that youth just don't care. When you have convinced yourself that someone doesn't care, that absolves you, with your badge and gun, of engaging them humanely. Period, point blank. And it makes you feel better about using force because these young people don't care anyway. And so I got to make sure I get home safely at night. Those kids, they're just going to do what they do. And so I'm going to punch them, I'm going to put my knee in their throat, and I might even shoot them if I have to because they don't care. And what most police, especially police in Columbus, don't understand is it's that thought process, that mentality that is bred from racist culture within the police and within the larger society that causes the issues that make people feel like they have to go out in a pandemic and protest. The simple answer to that is defunding the police in favor of funding, with those resources you take away, funding enrichment programs, funding equitable access to education, and other such opportunities, right? A safe environment to live and grow, equitable access to opportunities, culturally relevant, high quality education, mental health services, and other such enrichment programs. Then what you're doing is you're creating a police force that is able to then respond to the highest and most dangerous needs, right? If there's an active robbery, if someone has been murdered, that's okay, great. But if we're dealing with all these other issues that are a result of a toxic culture, you don't need to show up with your badge and gun. You don't need to arrest somebody, a young black male in this case, talk to them about how their behaviors are going to possibly end up in their death and expect them to hear you and not do and change their behaviors. I don't trust you, so why would they trust you? If we are building a just and equitable society, then that means we are funding opportunities that shift the focus away from activities and behaviors that are detrimental to society to ones that add value to society. But you can only do that if you yourself feel valued. How do I know this? Because I worked at Boys and Girls Clubs. And I worked at Boys and Girls Clubs, and I ran a club that had primarily, most of the members were black men, young black men, teenagers. They exhibited behaviors that are outlined to a certain extent in this article. And what I did over 3 years was just teach them why they should value themselves through their own history, through highlighting their own brilliance, through celebrating even the smallest achievements. You signed your name. No, not that small. But in some cases, playing with them like that to make light of a situation, but let them know that I am watching and I am supporting them. And within 3 years, the majority of those young people who came 2 or 3 times a week began to shift their behavior. I didn't have to play respectability politics. I didn't have to tell them to pull up their pants, and I didn't have to tell them to change their language. In fact, I rarely ever said any of those things unless it was obsessive. All I did was pour into those young people. All I did was show them that I cared with them, myself and my staff, showed them that we cared for them. And as they began to believe that somebody cared about them, they started to change their behavior on their own. The problem is, it took 3 years to begin to see those changes. And most of white society will not make an investment of 3 years, let alone 10 years, in order to begin the work of changing these environments. And that's what it takes. It's human development. It takes time. And each human being is unique and special in and of themselves. And we have to honor that and value that. So what would it be if we defunded the police or reallocated funds, because people have problems with the term defund, reallocated funds to make sure that we had officers who were social folks, like social workers or what have you, that would show up and not have to really have a gun and help people get through their situation, right?
Someone is requesting an extra 15 minutes.
Someone's requesting an extra 15 minutes. We'll see what we can do. So when we talk about reallocation of dollars in police budgets, it is because the police, no matter how much training they have, no matter how well-intentioned, and I don't like that phrase, but we use it for the sake of argument, how quote-unquote well-intentioned they may be, they are not equipped to handle the issues that these young black men are facing. And there's no research that I found that says that more police means less crime, because crime is not the issue. Crime is a manifestation of deeper cultural issues that foundationally are bred in racist ideas, ideals, and systems and structures, right? So the mayor, any mayor, does not need to wage war on guns illegally in the hands of young people. They need to be about the work, the mayor and city council, they need to be about the work of building just, equitable, and inclusive societies and communities in their cities. Police, more often than not, if we have just, equitable, and inclusive societies, don't need the militarized aspects of their budget and their equipment, because they're responding to highest needs that are often, in this ideal sensibility, violent, right? And if there's no violence attached to it, then we don't need you with your badge and gun. We need somebody who's equipped to deal with people. And then thirdly, the community, right? This neighbor, quote unquote neighbor, says these kids don't have a conscience, right? This is a very dangerous perception because, as I've said, it allows people to more easily weaponize the police against black and brown bodies, number one. Number two, it prevents people, because of their fear of these people who don't care, these super predators, these bestial young men, right, which is crap. But it prevents those people from investing time and effort to actually become a neighbor. There's a difference between being a neighbor and being neighborly. Being a neighbor means proximity. Being neighborly means you're developing a relationship, right? So what if we actually started treating each other like neighbors, being neighborly? What if we honored each other's humanity because we're all human beings? And what if we valued our differences because those differences are the threads of a beautiful communal tapestry that makes where we live what it is? I guarantee if the civic leaders focused more on creating a just, equitable, and inclusive society, and we reallocated dollars, because people say we don't have money for things. Well, our police force gets almost $400 million. Our school district, from the city budget, our school district gets less than $4 million. If we reallocated some of that $360 some odd million to the programs that we outlined, right? Enrichment programs, mental health services, culturally relevant high quality education, equitable access to opportunities, and a safe, fun environment for young people to live and grow, then your policing needs will decrease. And if we acted as though we valued each other, if we really did, not just act and perform, but we actually valued each other as human beings, society would shift. The reason why we can't do that is because America is a criminogenic society, and that criminal nature of American society has lived and generated so much. It's lived within the fear and prejudices it creates amongst the people. That's what redlining did, right? When you relegate one group of people here and another group of people there, they never interact. They don't know each other. And so it's really easy for lies to be told to one group of people that prevent this other group of people from experiencing the fullness of participation in society. Black people are criminal, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, they're rapists, right? Because this group of people never go over here and understand black people, and these black people never go over there and get to, well, we have to know white folk because, hey, it's a white society. But because we don't ever interact on a human level, these narratives are perpetuated, and white people are afraid, and black people are afraid, and everybody's prejudiced, but only white people are racist. And they build racist systems to keep those black people who are criminal and rapists and all that kind of stuff over there and confined. And then you wonder why we tear our own stuff up. That's what happens to human beings who are trapped, who are oppressed. White people would do it too if the tables were turned, I guarantee it. How do I know? Because there's something called white rage and white fragility. White rage is, an example, is the white working class male, quote unquote, white working class male. These lower middle class folks who believe that they should have more than what they have simply because they're white and they work hard. But what they don't understand is they got the white hand of fellowship from the wealthy white elite. So those folks can continue to be the barrier between the people who run things, white, wealthy men, patriarchal society, and black people. It's in American history. Just go read the books. Who were the founding people? No, they were the founding fathers. And many of them owned slaves. Many of them made their wealth as lawyers and accountants because of the slave trade, right? There wasn't no white women there, and there wasn't no poor white men there. So America has never been for everybody. It's always been for the elite. In a case so stark in Columbus, Ohio, where you have this poor reporting because no one asked why. Nobody sought to understand the actual victims. The victims are not just the people who were shot or killed by the guns. The victims are the people who did the shooting as well. And they're victims of the same thing. Racist American society, classist American society, all of that led to those people getting shot. So I would argue in that context that every time a black person takes the life of another black person, every time a poor white person commits a crime, those deeds, that blood is on the hands of the wealthy white elite. It's on the hands of the racist structure and systems that America refuses to dismantle. Bringing down statues, putting Black Lives Matter on the street ain't changing nothing. These young men in this article don't care about a Columbus statue. They don't care about a statue of a Confederate soldier. They don't care about the Confederate flag. They don't care about none of that. What I know they care about is whether or not we care about them. And that's all anybody ever wants. So if we want to fix these issues, then we need to think less about racism as a health crisis as it impacts people experiencing racism, and think about it as a psychological issue that white racist America has at the individual, systemic, and infrastructure level. It's ingrained in this criminogenic, psychopathic society. Let's deal with that. Let's see each other for the human beings that we are. And let's invest resources, time, talent, and treasure in building a just and equitable society. I'll catch y'all next week.